So let's now get started with these URLs and views. And for this, I'll dive into the blog application folder, which we created. And in there, as we did it before, I'll add a urls.py file, which is that file that allows us to register the URLs. And we got a urls.py file in the My Site folder already, but as you learned, that's the project-wide URLs folder. We also want one for our specific app. In our own urls.py file, we also want to add the urls pattern variable for which Django will be looking to find our URLs for this app. And in there, we want to use that path function provided by Django. And for this, from Django URLs, we import path. Now, path, as you learned, takes the path, so that thing after the domain, and then the view to which you want to map it. And here we in the end have these three paths which are outlined here on this slide. We have an empty path for the starting page, we have the posts path, and then we have this path with the dynamic segment for the individual posts. Therefore, I'll start with the empty path for the starting page then. Then I'll add another path for posts, and a third path with that dynamic segment. So with posts, and then slash, and then this dynamic segment, which you learned is marked with angle brackets. Now you can give this any name you want, and you will later then in your view receive an argument of that name, a parameter of that name, which holds the concrete value for which this path was triggered. That's also what you learned before. I'll name this slug here because this concept is called slug. This concept of having URLs like this, my first post. My first post, path segments that look like this are called a slug. And that's a widely spread concept in the end. For example, on our own website, there, if you click on one of the tutorials, you also have this slug here. And that's a unique identifier which we then use behind the scenes to identify this specific article. It's simply a search engine friendly identifier. You could also have an ID, which is just a number, which could also be a unique identifier, but that would be less search engine friendly since it holds no information about the resource that's being located, and it's also less meaningful to your users. That's why you typically use these slugs. And this slug concept is so common that Django actually has a built-in path transformer for slugs. You learned about int and str transformers earlier in the course. There also is a slug transformer. And this does in the end one main thing. It checks if the concrete value which is passed in here when this path is reached has this slug format, which basically means it's some text which consists only of characters and numbers and then may contain dashes, but it doesn't contain any other special characters or anything like this. So it's basically a value which has this kind of format. And attached you find a link to the official Django docs where you find the exact definition for this slug transformer. But in the end, it makes sure that only URLs that look like this trigger this path. So with that, we have these three paths. They are missing their views though. Therefore, we should go to views.py and define our functions there, our views functions. And I'll start with the index function, or actually maybe starting page function for the starting page, as the name suggests. In there, we get the request. This parameter will be passed in automatically by Django, and we should return a response. So we could import the HTTP response, but we're soon going to return a template anyways, and therefore for the moment, I'll just pass here, but we're going to add the concrete body for this function very soon. Now we also have a function called posts, which is then required for our posts route, for our posts URL, which should later display this page with all the posts. And we then have that view function for an individual post, which should be triggered for this last path. And we could name this single post or post detail, something like this. Now, the function implementations are missing at the moment, but of course, we're also going to add those soon. Now we can wire up those views functions to our URLs. And for this, in the urls.py file, we need to import from the current folder our views file. And then with that, here we want to trigger the starting page function for this first path. For the second path, we want to trigger the posts function. And for the third path, we want to trigger the post detail function. We can also give those paths a name if we want to. And that might be handy for constructing URLs later, because you learned that using names and the reverse function or the URL tag in templates simply ensures that you don't have to hard code the URL, but you can let Django resolve the exact URL, which means that if you ever make changes here, you don't need to adjust all the places where you reference that URL. And therefore, I'll give each path a name with that name keyword argument. I'll name the first one here starting page. Give this here a name of posts, or maybe posts page to be in line with starting page. And then here for the third path, we have the post detail page. And those names are up to you, of course. Now I reformatted this with the format document shortcut, and therefore this is what we have now. So now we have the views, even though they're empty, and we have the URLs. Now, of course, we want to wire up those URLs to the project-wide URLs to make sure that our project is aware of these URLs we got there. And for that, we need this include function, which we import from Django URLs. Now with include imported, we register another path here, and then we specify the leading path segment for which this path should become active, and I'll come back to that in a second. And as a second argument, we then include our blog URLs. So blog is our app name here, our folder name as well, and URLs, that's this file which holds the URLs. So now we're including this, but now we need to decide for which path we actually want to load those URLs. And we could, for example, use blog / here. That would mean that if someone visits localhost 8000 during development, later after deployment, that will be our real domain. But during development, it's localhost 8000 / blog, and then / nothing would lead to the starting page, / posts would lead to the posts page, and / post my first post would lead to the post detail page. That is something we could do. We could also say that for this page, the blog is kind of the main app. It's also our only app here, actually. And therefore, we might not want to load this app and its URLs with that extra segment here, but instead we might want to make sure that if you visit just localhost 8000 / nothing, this shows the starting page instead of / blog. Because otherwise, localhost 8000 will give a 404 error. And that's actually a behavior we have in our monthly challenges project if you try out just localhost 8000 there. There, for just this path, you get a 404 error because we have no path for / nothing. There, it's fine because that's just a dummy project. But here, this should be a realistic project. And therefore, I would argue that we should ensure that if you visit just our domain / nothing, you see the starting page. And since the starting page is one of the paths here, I think it makes sense that we load this entire blog module simply for an empty path, so that localhost / nothing leads to the URLs we have set up here. So then for / nothing, we load the starting page. For posts, we load posts page, and so on. And I hope I could make it clear why we're doing it like this. It simply ensures that for /posts, for example, we see the posts, for /nothing, we see the starting page, and we don't have that extra blog prefix in front of everything. That's my idea here. So there was a lot of talking about this, but I want to make it sure why I'm making certain decision and what you should consider when you're building your own projects, and that's why I am spending some time on this. With that though, we got our URLs and our views, even though they don't have any logic yet, and we have those registered with our main project. So therefore now I think as a next step, it makes sense to add a couple of templates so that in our views, we can return and render those templates, and we can then slowly get started with adding real content. One quick note though, I see that I named it URLs pattern, which actually is wrong, which is why I'm getting an error down there. It should be URL patterns. So no S after URL, but an S after pattern. With that, if I save this, now this error is gone. So that's a little adjustment we of course should make. Now, however, let's add a couple of templates.